Welcome back to the fourth and final section of the peripheral nervous system lecture. In this section, we're going to talk about some different reflexes. So in general, reflexes can be divided into classifications. So we have inborn or intrinsic reflexes. And these reflexes are the rapid, involuntary, very predictable motor responses to a stimulus. So an example of an intrinsic reflex would be something such as maintaining posture or controlling visceral activities like digestion. These are things that automatically happen without us even trying. But these particular reflexes can be modified through learning and through conscious effort. So even though they're inborn, they're intrinsic, they can actually be modified over time through learning. And then the other type of reflexes we have are the learned or acquired reflexes. And these particular reflexes are the reflexes that result from practice or through repetition. And so the example here would be like driving skills. For example, if you're following somebody and they hit their brakes in front of you, what do automatically? You just immediately hit your brakes, right? And so this requires a really fast reaction time. And so we would call it a reflex. That would be, a driving reflex that you learned because you have been driving for a while. So that's just an example of a learned reflex. We can also break down reflexes into functional classifications. So we have somatic reflexes, and the somatic reflexes are going to be the ones that activate our skeletal muscles. And the other functional classification are the autonomic reflexes or the visceral reflexes. And these are going to be the reflexes that activate our visceral effectors, such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or our glands and organs. So continuing on with our overview of reflexes, all reflex arcs contain 5 basic parts. So the first part is the receptor, and the receptor is going to be where the stimulus action occurs. And so the example that's shown here is the receptor is going to be located in the skin, and it's going to receive information from some sort of stimulus. In this case, say you poke your finger with a needle. You are going to, the needle is going to activate the receptor that's located right here in the skin. And then the next component of the reflex arc is the sensory neuron. So the sensory neuron is going to transmit information from the receptor towards the central nervous system. The third component of our reflex arc is going to be an integration center. And the integration center is going to be either monosynaptic, meaning there's only one synapse that occurs, or polysynaptic, meaning that there's going to be multiple different synapses occurring. So these regions are either going to be mono or polysynaptic, but the integration center is always within the central nervous system. So it's either going to be in the brain or in the spinal cord. In this particular example, this is a integration center that is in the spinal cord. And this example is also going to be polysynaptic because there are 2 synapses that are occurring within the spinal cord. So the first synapse we see is occurring here between the sensory neuron and this interneuron. And then the second synapse is occurring here between the interneuron and the motor neuron. The motor neuron is the 4th component of our reflex arc that's going to conduct efferent information and impulses from the integration center to the effector organ. And in this example, the effector is a muscle, but in general, an effector can be either a muscle fiber or a gland cell that's going to respond to the efferent impulses by either contracting So for example, the muscle would contract, or by secreting a substance if this is a visceral reflex where something like a gland would be stimulated. Okay, so all reflexes contain these 5 basic components. So kind of talking along this general understanding, spinal reflexes are reflexes that are occurring without any direct involvement of the higher brain centers. So basically, this is going to look something like what that last picture showed, where we had a stimulus coming in and synapsing. We'll say maybe there's an interneuron. And we're going to call this one our motor neuron. So we're going to say that all of this is occurring within the spinal cord. Okay, so basically what I'm saying about spinal reflexes is that these are reflexes that are entering into the spinal cord, but we can see that they're also leaving directly from the spinal cord. So here we have an interneuron, so here's where the integration is occurring. And in some cases that are not spinal reflexes, that information that we receive is also going to be sent up to the brain. That is not the case with spinal reflexes. We do not send that information up to the brain. And the reason for this really is because if you think about what's happening here, this is a reflex, and reflexes need to be really fast responses. So we have some sort of stimulus happen, sensory neuron goes in here. We need to be able to integrate that information and provide a really rapid response to that information. If we have to send that information all the way up to the brain has to integrate it, send the information back down to the motor effect and then to the effector. That takes time. And so in spinal reflexes, these are really great ways to receive information and respond quickly to that information. So we don't actually necessarily need the input of the brain for our spinal reflexes. Kind of going along with this, even though the brain isn't necessarily influencing the response to a stimulus, the brain is still made aware of what's happening. So it's kind of like one of those do now, ask for forgiveness later sort of situations. So the spinal cord is handling the situation, and then after the fact is telling the brain, hey, this is what happened, and this is how I handled it. So that's kind of what I mean by that the brain is still advised of the reflex activity. Spinal reflexes are relevant to us clinically because we can assess the condition of the nervous system by testing spinal reflexes. And if their spinal reflexes are exaggerated, or if they're distorted, or if they're completely absent, this might indicate to us there's some sort of degeneration or some sort of pathology in specific regions within this nervous system. And so we're going to talk about 4 commonly assessed reflexes over the next couple of slides. And those 4 reflexes are going to be the patellar reflex, the withdrawal reflex, crossed extensor reflex, and plantar reflex. So we're going to start then with our patellar reflex. So the patellar reflex is one that you might be familiar with. You take the hammer and you hit the knee just below the kneecap, and then all of us pretty much know that what happens to that is our leg kicks out. And the reason that this is happening is actually because the rectus femoris specifically comes to the quadriceps tendon, which then attaches to the patella, and then the patella has this patellar ligament which goes on and attaches to the tibial tuberosity. And because of the connection of all of these structures, of all four of these structures, by hitting this tendon, you're actually stretching the muscle. And so the stretching of these muscle spindles is going to initiate what we call a stretch reflex. And basically, in a stretch reflex, if a muscle is stretched, we immediately try to do something to decrease the stretch. Or to, I guess, bring it back to its original size. And so we do this in the patellar reflex by contracting the stretch muscle, because muscle contraction is going to shorten the muscle. And we also, at the same time, have to inhibit the muscle that opposes that action. So if the quads are responsible for extending the leg, the hamstrings are responsible for flexing the leg. So if we want to contract this top muscle, we make this muscle shorter, the leg is going to kick out. We also need to inhibit the flexors so that they don't prevent the kicking out of the leg. So in the patellar reflex, the quadriceps is going to be the one that's stretched and is stimulated to contract, and the hamstrings are then inhibited. So let's go through this pathway together then. So the stimulus here is going to be, so the receptor, I should say, then is going to be muscle spindles, but those muscle spindles are stimulated whenever we tap the patellar ligament. So that excites the muscle spindle. So the receptor is the muscle spindle. And then the sensory or afferent impulses are going to travel to the spinal cord, where they are going to synapse with motor neurons and with interneurons. The motor neurons, which is in red, is going to send an activating impulse to the quadriceps and cause the quadriceps to contract, which extends the knee. Because we also synapsed on this green interneuron, this interneuron is actually going to create an inhibitory signal. And that inhibitory signal is going to be sent along this purple axon and synapse on the hamstrings muscle. And because this is an inhibitory signal, the inhibitory signal prevents the hamstrings from resisting the contraction of the quadriceps. So notice that we have both a monosynaptic and a polysynaptic situation going on here. The sensory to the red motor neuron is monosynaptic, right? Because there's only one synapse involved in that pathway. But the sensory branch that synapses on the interneuron, which then synapses on the purple motor neuron, this is multisynaptic, or polysynaptic. There's more than one synapse. Okay, so this is how the patellar reflex works. And notice that this information is not sent up spinal tracts to the brain. This just is occurring at the level of the spinal cord that the signal comes in. So in this case, this would be spinal levels L2 to L4. If there's a problem, for example, with the patellar reflex, if it doesn't work, you don't have the reflex that you should, that could indicate to a clinician that there could be a problem with the spinal cord at these particular levels, at L2 to L4 levels. Okay? So the second reflex that we're going to talk about is called the flexor withdrawal reflex. And this reflex causes an automatic withdrawal of a threatened body part. And This particular reflex is also ipsilateral, so it's one-sided, and it's polysynaptic, meaning it is more than one synapse occurring. Many different muscles might need to be called into play in this reflex, so it really needs to be polysynaptic. And this particular reflex is protective and very important to survival. This is one of the reflexes that the brain can actually override. So the example here that I'm going to give you guys is a hot stove. Okay, so the stimulus here is we're going to have our sensory receptor on the skin, and say you put your hand down on a hot stove. That is going to stimulate those receptors and send us a sensory signal through the afferent pathway up to the spinal cord at whatever level this is going to enter the spinal cord. Okay, and then we have multiple different synapses occurring. So one synapse, so number one here, is going to be a stimulatory synapse. That's why there's plus signs. Okay, so it's going to synapse on this green interneuron, which stimulates this first motor neuron here, this darker red one, to send a positive signal out to the biceps muscle. And contraction of the biceps muscle is going to decrease the angle of the elbow, so it's going to cause your arm to move up towards your body and off of the hot stove. Simultaneously, this second synapse that's occurring is synapsing onto an inhibitory interneuron, so this pink interneuron here. And this creates an inhibitory signal which gets sent along a motor axon and synapses on the triceps muscle. If we are flexing the biceps muscle, we do not want our triceps to prevent our biceps from flexing. Okay, so we need to inhibit the triceps muscle so that our biceps muscle can contract and our arm can move upward, because if this isn't inhibited, then your hand will just stay where it's at. Okay. Also, there's one more synapse that I'm going to talk about, and this is going to be a synapse that's occurring to this black interneuron over here. And this is going to be a stimulatory signal as well that synapses onto this interneuron, which crosses over and is sent up to the brain. Okay, because remember I said the brain can override the flexor withdrawal reflex. So because you're also telling the brain what's going on in this particular instance, the brain might decide that you want to keep your finger on that hot stimulus, and therefore you can override this whole reflex. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. So the third reflex that I'm going to discuss with you is called the crossed extensor reflex. And this one actually occurs with the flexor reflex that I just talked about. But this one is occurring in limbs that are weight bearing, so specifically our legs, and this reflex is used to help us maintain our balance. This reflex consists of a ipsilateral withdrawal reflex and a contralateral extensor reflex. So basically what this means is that you have a same-sided withdrawal, so this would be a contraction. So the stimulated side is going to be withdrawn, and contralateral, so this is the opposite side, is going to be extended. The example that I'm going to give to you guys, it would be stepping barefoot on broken glass. And this particular reflex is going to cause the foot that you stepped on the glass with to withdraw, to contract and lift up. And then it's also going to cause the other leg to extend to sort of push down so that you can maintain your balance. All right, so let's talk about what's exactly going on in this example. Okay, so the site of the stimulus then is, you're going to have receptors right here on the toe. And so we're going to have the stimulus that's going to stimulate the receptors on the toe. It's going to send an afferent signal up into the spinal cord, where that signal is then going to synapse on some interneurons. Okay, so this first interneuron is going to do several different things. It's going to send a stimulatory signal along this red motor neuron to the hamstrings muscle. Okay, if the hamstrings are stimulated, that means they're going to contract. They are going to shorten, and we know shortening of hamstrings causes the leg to flex. At the same time, the same interneuron synapses on yet another interneuron, but this one's going to be an inhibitory synapse. So this purple motor neuron sends a signal down to the extensors, so our quads muscles, and tells them, don't resist the action of the hamstrings. Okay, so it inhibits our quadriceps muscles. This is all ipsilateral withdrawal reflex. Okay, so this side of the equation is ipsilateral withdrawal reflex. Okay, simultaneously, we had that signal come in and we synapsed on this first interneuron. This interneuron, like I said, it had 3 branches. This third branch, oops, sorry about that. So this third interneuron is actually going to cross over. We can see that happening here. It's crossing over. So this is where the contralateral side is going to come into play. And it's going to synapse on 2 more interneurons. It's going to synapse on a second and third interneuron, which sends a positive signal, a stimulatory signal, to, so that would be this purple one, to the quads, telling the quads to contract. And it's sending an inhibitory signal to the hamstrings, telling them to not contract, rather, okay? Because if we contracted these, that would also bend the leg. We don't want to do that. So instead we contract our quads, and this allows us to stand on our foot, on the unhurt foot. So at the same time that this pathway is occurring, where you're going to end up flexing this leg, at the exact same time, this leg is receiving what we call reciprocal activation. So the extensor muscles on the opposite side are activated, okay? So hopefully that makes sense, and if it doesn't, then I encourage you to stand up and perform this sort of action and put your hands on your legs and feel what muscles are contracting as you lift up one leg and are keeping the other leg planted, okay? So the fourth and the final reflex that I'm going to talk to you guys about is the plantar reflex. And this particular reflex tests the integrity of the spinal cord from L2 to S2. And so the stimulus for this reflex is a stroke to the lateral aspect of the sole of the foot, which you can see here. The response should be a downward flexion of the toes, which you can see here. If there is damage to the motor cortex or to the corticospinal tracts, that will cause an abnormal response. And that abnormal response is something we call Babinski's sign. And in Babinski's sign, what happens is the hallux is actually going to dorsiflex. So you're going to pull your big toe towards your leg, and the smaller toes actually tend to fan laterally. Now, if this occurs in an adult, this is abnormal, okay? If the Babinski sign occurs in an adult, that is abnormal. However, Babinski's sign is normal during infancy until the age of about 1 year old. And the reason for this is because the myelination is still incomplete at this time. And so you don't get this normal plantar reflex because the nerves aren't fully developed yet on the bottom of the feet. So in an infant up to a 1 year old, Babinski's sign is normal. Past that, it is pathological in adulthood, okay? So I just wanted to bring that one up because that's kind of a cool thing. If you have any little kids around, like under the age of 1, and you stroke the bottom of your foot, you should see their toes curl upwards like this. And we are done with the peripheral nervous system lecture. So here are some really good and awesome memes that I found and one small GIF over here. Check out those reflexes. And I will talk to you guys next week when we cover the autonomic nervous system.